The morning had started like any other for J.D. Vance. He arrived at the airport 2 hours early, went through security with the usual mix of recognition from some TSA agents and complete indifference from others, and made his way to the premium lounge to catch up on emails before his flight from Washington to Los Angeles. Being vice president meant a lot of travel, and after months in the role, he had his routine down to a science. A coffee, black, no sugar, a quick scan of the morning headlines, and a few necessary calls before boarding began. Today's flight was particularly important. He was heading to a series of meetings with tech industry leaders about bringing more manufacturing jobs back to the Midwest. When boarding was announced, Vance gathered his things, nodded politely to the lounge attendant, and headed to gate C-23. People watched him walk by, some doing double takes, others pretending not to notice. He was used to it by now, that strange mix of fame that comes with high office but isn't quite movie star recognition. "Good morning, Mr. Vice President," the gate agent said with a professional smile, scanning his boarding pass. "Enjoy your flight." Vance boarded with the first group, settled into seat 2A, window, his preference, and arranged his things. The leather seat was comfortable, spacious, the kind of luxury that still sometimes felt strange to a kid who grew up with so little in Middletown, Ohio. He pulled out his briefing materials and began reviewing notes for the upcoming meetings. Other first-class passengers filed in, most giving him that look of recognition followed by studied casualness that he'd grown accustomed to. A businessman across the aisle nodded respectfully. An older woman smiled briefly before taking her seat. This was the normal rhythm of travel for someone in his position. The plane was nearly fully boarded when Vance noticed a commotion at the front of the cabin. The lead flight attendant was in a hushed but intense conversation with another crew member, both occasionally glancing in his direction. After a moment, they seemed to reach some kind of decision, and the lead attendant, a woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded him of his grandmother, approached his seat. "Mr. Vice President," she said quietly, leaning down slightly to maintain privacy, "I'm terribly sorry, but we have a situation that requires your assistance." Vance put down his papers. "Of course. What's the problem?" The flight attendant's professional composure cracked slightly, revealing genuine discomfort. "Sir, due to a booking error, we need to ask if you would be willing to relocate to economy class." A nearby passenger looked up, clearly overhearing, then quickly pretended to be absorbed in the safety card. "I understand this is highly unusual," she continued, her voice dropping even lower. "But we have a family boarding who needs special accommodations that only these seats can provide. The airline's management has been contacted, but with our departure time." Vance's expression remained neutral, though a slight crease appeared between his eyebrows. The flight attendant tensed, clearly expecting the kind of reaction that important people often have when their status perks are threatened. Instead, Vance simply asked, "Is there an emergency or medical situation?" "I'm not at liberty to share details, sir, but yes, there are special circumstances," she replied, relief evident that he wasn't immediately protesting. Vance nodded slowly, glancing around the cabin where several passengers were now pretending not to watch this unusual scene unfold. A Secret Service agent stationed at the front of the cabin stepped forward slightly, looking concerned. "I see," Vance said, beginning to gather his papers. "Where would you like me to move to?" The flight attendant's shoulders visibly relaxed. "We have a seat in row 16, sir." Again, I cannot apologize enough for this inconvenience. As Vance stood and collected his bag from the overhead bin, whispers spread through the first-class cabin. The businessman across the aisle looked shocked. A woman nearby pulled out her phone, clearly eager to share this unusual sight of a vice president being bumped from first class. Vance caught the eye of his Secret Service detail and gave a slight nod that everything was fine. As he followed the flight attendant toward economy class, he couldn't help but notice the family waiting to board, a tired-looking couple with worry etched on their faces, standing beside what appeared to be specialized medical equipment. In that moment, something in his expression shifted from mere acceptance to understanding. As J.D. Vance made his way down the narrow aisle toward economy class, the curious stares of passengers followed him. Some pulled out phones, others whispered to their seatmates. It wasn't every day you saw the Vice President of the United States being moved to the back of the plane. The flight attendant leading him seemed more nervous than he was, repeatedly apologizing under her breath. "This is highly unusual, sir." "I can't thank you enough for your understanding." Vance just nodded, his mind still on the family he had glimpsed waiting to board. There had been something in their eyes, exhaustion mixed with worry, that struck a chord with him. He knew that look. He'd seen it on his grandmother's face years ago during the hardest times in Ohio. As they reached row 16, a young flight attendant was hurriedly ensuring the seat was ready, brushing crumbs from the previous flight off the cushion. "Your seat, Mr. Vice President," the lead attendant said, gesturing to the middle seat between two already occupied spots. His Secret Service agent, who had followed behind, looked concerned. "Sir, this arrangement poses security challenges. Perhaps we should." "It's fine, Tom," Vance said quietly. "We'll manage." The agent didn't look convinced but nodded reluctantly. "I'll be seated directly behind you, sir." Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, the reason for Vance's displacement was becoming clear. A little girl, no more than 8 years old, was being carefully carried aboard by her father. She wore braces on her legs, and her breathing seemed assisted by a portable device. Behind them, her mother carried several medical bags, her face tight with the stress that comes from constantly navigating a world not built for children with special needs. The flight attendants quickly surrounded the family, helping them get settled in the spacious first-class seats where the girl could be comfortable during the 5-hour flight. The medical equipment that would have been impossible to accommodate in the cramped economy section was carefully stowed. "We've adjusted the temperature for this section as requested," one attendant explained to the parents. "And we've noted your daughter's dietary restrictions for the meal service." The father, a man with tired eyes and a 3-day stubble, looked around nervously. "We didn't expect. When they called us this morning about the accommodation, we thought maybe they'd found us a row of economy seats together." "The airline made a decision based on our special circumstances policy," the attendant explained discreetly. "Sometimes we make adjustments for medical necessities." Back in economy, Vance settled between a college-aged boy wearing headphones and an older man reading a paperback thriller. Neither immediately recognized him in the dim cabin light, which suited Vance just fine. He pulled out his briefing materials again, though his concentration had shifted. 15 minutes into the flight, Vance noticed one of the attendants from first class making her way down the aisle, stopping when she spotted him. "Mr. Vice President," she said quietly, leaning down. "I wanted to personally explain the situation. The little girl up front has a rare condition that makes it difficult for her to breathe at altitude. She needs the space for her equipment and to keep her legs elevated during the flight." Vance nodded. "I figured it was something like that. No explanation needed." "The airline didn't tell the family who was moved to accommodate them," she continued. "They were worried it might make them uncomfortable to know." "Good," Vance said. "Keep it that way." The flight attendant seemed surprised by his response. "Sir, most VIPs in this situation would be." She trailed off, not wanting to finish the thought. "Raising hell," Vance offered with a slight smile. "Look, I grew up in a town where people helped each other when things got tough. No one made a big show of it. That's just what neighbors did." She studied him for a moment, as if seeing something unexpected. "Well, thank you for understanding. Can I bring you anything to make you more comfortable back here?" "I'm fine," Vance said, then reconsidered. "Actually, could you tell me more about the family? Not their names or personal details, just their situation." The flight attendant hesitated, then sat briefly in the empty aisle seat across from him while the seatbelt sign was off. "They're flying to Los Angeles for a specialized treatment program," she explained quietly. "The father mentioned they've been trying to get into it for nearly a year. It's their best hope for improving their daughter's quality of life, but the insurance battles have been." She shook her head. "Well, you can imagine." Vance listened intently, his policy mind already connecting dots between this family's struggle and the healthcare debates he'd been part of in Washington. But more than that, the human side of him was turning over a thought, one that would soon lead to action that nobody on the plane could have predicted. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the cabin settled into the rhythms of a long flight. People pulled out books, laptops, and headphones, while flight attendants began preparing for the first drink service. In row 16, J.D. Vance shifted in his cramped middle seat, trying to find a comfortable position for his long legs. The young man beside him was typing furiously on a laptop, textbooks spread across his tray table despite the limited space. Every few minutes he'd sigh, delete everything he'd written, and start again. On Vance's other side, the older gentleman had dozed off, his paperback thriller fallen closed on his lap. His weathered hands bore the calluses of someone who'd worked with tools his whole life. Vance tried to return to his briefing papers, but found his mind drifting to the family in first class. He'd seen too many families like theirs during his childhood. Good people driven to the edge by medical bills and bureaucratic mazes. The flight attendant's words about their insurance battles have struck a nerve. A slight bump of turbulence caused the young man's coffee to slosh dangerously close to his laptop. Vance instinctively reached out to steady the cup. "Thanks," the student said, glancing up briefly, then doing a double take as recognition dawned slowly. "Wait, aren't you?" J.D. Vance, he confirmed with a small smile. "And you are?" "Pete," the young man said, looking bewildered. "I'm studying political science at Georgetown." He gestured to his laptop. "Trying to finish a paper on economic policy before we land, actually." "Due tomorrow?" Vance asked, recognizing the frantic energy of a last-minute assignment. "Tonight," Pete admitted sheepishly. "My professor doesn't accept late work, even if you're 30,000 feet in the air when it's due." "Tough professor." "The toughest," Pete agreed. "But also the best. She actually assigned your book last semester." He hesitated. "I gotta ask, what are you doing back here in economy? Don't you guys usually fly private anyway?" Before Vance could answer, the older man beside him stirred awake, catching the tail end of the question. "Son," the older man said to Pete, his voice carrying the slight twang of Appalachia, "it doesn't matter where a man sits on a plane. What matters is how he treats the people around him." The older man turned to Vance, extending a hand. "Frank Miller. Served in the Marines for 20 years, then spent another 30 building houses. Just heading out to see my new grandbaby in California." "Congratulations," Vance said, shaking his hand firmly. "First grandchild?" "Fourth," Frank said proudly, pulling out his phone to show pictures. "But the first boy? My daughters all had girls until now." The conversation flowed naturally after that. Frank talked about his years in construction, how he'd seen towns in Ohio and Pennsylvania transform as factories closed and jobs disappeared. Pete occasionally chimed in with questions about economic policy that showed he was smarter than his procrastination habits suggested. Not once did Frank or Pete ask Vance about being bumped from first class, though he could tell they were curious. Instead, they treated him like any other traveler, which felt refreshingly normal. An hour into the flight, the drink cart finally reached their row. "Coffee, please," Pete requested, holding out his empty cup. "Water for me," said Frank. The flight attendant turned to Vance. "And for you, Mr. Vice President?" "Just water as well, thank you." As she poured the drinks, the attendant leaned down slightly. "Sir, the captain asked me to extend his apologies again for the seating situation. He's offered to have a word with you when we land." "That's really not necessary," Vance replied. "Everything's fine." Frank raised an eyebrow after she moved on. "So you really did get bumped from first class?" "Huh. Wouldn't have thought they'd do that to someone like you." "Someone like me?" Vance questioned. "You know, important," Frank clarified. "In my experience, the more important people think they are, the less they're willing to be inconvenienced." Pete looked uncomfortable, but Vance just laughed. "My grandmother would agree with you completely. She raised me to believe that nobody's too important to move over and make room when someone needs it more." The conversation might have continued, but Pete suddenly cursed under his breath, hitting his keyboard in frustration. "Problem?" Vance asked. "The Wi-Fi's out," Pete explained desperately. "I need to access some research for this paper, and my hotspot isn't working at this altitude." "What's your paper about?" Vance asked, genuinely curious. "Manufacturing job loss in the Midwest and potential policy solutions," Pete said. "I was using some of your speeches as sources, actually." Vance smiled. "Well, I might be able to help with that." "I was heading to LA to talk about exactly those issues with some tech companies." For the next 30 minutes, as Frank dozed off again, Vance quietly helped Pete think through his paper, offering insights from his own experience and policy work. The young man frantically took notes, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief at his good fortune. What neither of them noticed was a passenger 2 rows ahead discreetly recording their interaction on a phone, capturing this unscripted moment between a vice president and a college student in the cramped quarters of economy class. 2 hours into the flight, the cabin lights dimmed for a movie. Pete had finally dozed off after finishing his paper, his laptop now stowed away. Frank was flipping through the in-flight magazine, occasionally pointing out places he visited during his Marine years. The cramped discomfort of economy class had faded into the background as Vance found himself genuinely enjoying the unexpected company. A soft ding sounded overhead, and the lead flight attendant's voice came through the speakers asking if there was a doctor on board. Heads turned as a woman several rows ahead stood up, identified herself as a pediatrician, and was quickly escorted to the front of the plane. Frank glanced at Vance. "Hope everything's all right up there." Vance nodded, his thoughts immediately going to the little girl in first class. He'd seen it happen before. Medical situations could escalate quickly at altitude. He watched as a flight attendant hurried past with an oxygen tank, her face tense. "Excuse me for a minute," Vance said, unbuckling his seatbelt and stepping carefully over Pete's sleeping form. His Secret Service agent straightened in his seat as Vance stood. "Sir." "Just stretching my legs," Vance assured him, though his intention was clear. Walking toward the front of the plane, Vance could feel eyes following him. He paused before the curtains separating economy from first class, hesitant to intrude. The flight attendant who had initially moved him spotted him and approached. "Mr. Vice President, everything's under control," she said quietly. "The little girl had some breathing difficulties, but the doctor says she's stabilizing. Her portable oxygen wasn't delivering properly at this altitude." "Is there anything I can do?" Vance asked. "That's very kind, sir, but we're handling it. The captain has already been in touch with ground medical services, and we're monitoring her closely." Before Vance could respond, the curtain parted and the pediatrician emerged, looking relieved. "She's going to be fine," she told the flight attendant. "The issue was with her equipment, not her condition. I've adjusted the settings and shown her parents how to monitor it for the rest of the flight." The doctor turned to leave, then did a double take upon recognizing Vance. "Mr. Vice President, I didn't expect to see you in economy." "Just another passenger today," Vance said with a slight smile. "The family needed the space more than I did." A thoughtful expression crossed the doctor's face. "You know, that family has been through a lot. Her father mentioned they've been traveling to specialists for 3 years trying to get answers. This treatment program in LA is their best hope." 3 years, Vance repeated, thinking about what that meant, the stress, the financial burden, the toll on their lives. "That's a long road." "Too long," the doctor agreed. "Our healthcare system doesn't make it easy for families with rare conditions." As they spoke, a small crowd of passengers had gathered in the aisle, pretending to wait for the bathroom while actually listening to the conversation. Vance noticed but didn't change his tone or words. "Thank you for helping them," he said simply. "It's what I do," she responded. "But I'm curious, most officials I've met wouldn't give up their seats so easily. What made you do it?" Frank's voice came from behind Vance. "Because he knows something a lot of folks in Washington forget," the older man said, having followed Vance up the aisle. "That power means nothing if you don't use it to help people who have none." The doctor smiled. "Sounds like something my father would say." Vance turned to Frank, surprised to see him standing there. "I thought you were reading your magazine." "Got curious," Frank admitted. "When a man in your position heads up to check on a sick kid, I figure it's worth seeing what happens next." More passengers had gathered now, their phones discreetly recording. Vance noticed but didn't comment. Instead, he turned back to the flight attendant. "Could you tell me how much longer the flight is?" he asked. "About 2 hours, sir." Vance nodded thoughtfully. "And the family, do they have transportation arranged once we land in LA?" "I'm not sure, sir." The doctor chimed in. "They mentioned taking a shuttle to their hotel. The treatment center is providing accommodations, but they're responsible for local transportation." Something shifted in Vance's expression, a decision being made. He pulled out his phone and quickly typed out a message before the flight attendant could remind him about in-flight regulations. "Sorry," he said, catching her look. "Important message. Airplane mode now, I promise." As he turned to head back to his seat, Frank fell into step beside him. "You're planning something, aren't you?" "Just thinking that sometimes being in a position of influence means you can cut through red tape," Vance replied. "That little girl shouldn't have to wait for a shuttle after what she's been through today." Frank studied him for a moment. "You know, when I saw you get moved to economy, I figured you'd be like most big shots, annoyed but putting on a good face for the cameras. But there weren't any cameras back there when you were helping that college kid with his paper. And there weren't any when you came up here to check on that little girl." Vance shrugged. "My grandmother would say that character is what you do when no one's watching." "Smart woman, your grandmother." What neither of them realized was that in the age of smartphones, someone was always watching. By the time they returned to their seats, clips of their conversation were already being uploaded to social media, about to spark a conversation that would extend far beyond the confines of Flight 2187. Back in his seat, Vance pulled out his notebook and began writing something by hand. Pete had woken up and was watching him curiously, but didn't interrupt. Frank had returned to his magazine, though he occasionally glanced over at what Vance was writing. "Old school," Pete finally commented, nodding at the notebook. "Most people in my classes just type everything." "Some things deserve the personal touch," Vance replied, carefully tearing the page from his notebook and folding it. He looked up and caught the eye of a passing flight attendant, different from the ones he'd spoken with earlier. "Excuse me," he said, "could you deliver this to the family in first class?" "The ones with the little girl who needed medical attention." The flight attendant looked uncertain. "I'm not sure that's allowed, sir, for security reasons." "It's just a note," Vance assured her. "No security concern, but I'd prefer if you didn't mention it came from me." The attendant took the folded paper hesitantly. "May I ask what it is?" "Just a small gesture," Vance said. He pulled out his wallet and added several $100 bills. "And this is to cover some comforts for them. Maybe a special meal, some extra blankets, whatever might help make their journey easier. But please, don't tell them who it's from." The flight attendant's expression softened. "That's very generous, sir." "It's nothing," Vance said. "Just between us." As the attendant walked away, Pete stared at Vance. "You just gave money to complete strangers and don't even want credit for it." "Money isn't the point," Vance explained. "It's about showing kindness when someone's going through a hard time." Frank nodded approvingly. "My wife would have done the same thing. 45 years married, and she never wanted recognition for her good deeds. Used to leave casseroles on doorsteps of folks who were struggling, wouldn't even knock on the door." 20 minutes later, the three men watched as flight attendants delivered unexpected items to the family in first class: premium headphones for the little girl, extra pillows, an ice cream sundae that wasn't on the regular menu, and even a stuffed airplane toy that must have come from the pilot's personal collection. The parents looked confused at first, then overwhelmed with gratitude, asking the attendants who was responsible. The crew simply smiled and said, "Just a little extra care for our special passengers." Meanwhile, in economy class, word had begun to spread. The woman who had been recording earlier had shown her seatmate the video of Vance checking on the family. That passenger told another, and soon whispers were traveling through the cabin. A flight attendant stopped by Vance's row with 3 complimentary glasses of champagne. "The captain heard about what you did, sir," she explained quietly. "He wanted to offer you and your seatmates a thank you." Frank accepted his glass with a nod. "First time I've had champagne since my daughter's wedding. Not bad." Pete looked at his glass in wonder. "Is this even legal?" "I'm only 20. International airspace," Frank winked. "Different rules." As they sipped their drinks, an announcement came over the speaker system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be beginning our descent into Los Angeles in about 20 minutes. The weather is clear, 75 degrees, and we're actually running ahead of schedule. Should have you at the gate about 15 minutes early." The captain paused, then added, "I'd also like to say that it's been an honor flying with all of you today. In my 30 years as a pilot, I've rarely seen the kind of compassion and humanity that's been displayed on this flight. It reminds me that regardless of our differences, we're all just people trying to get where we need to go, sometimes needing a little help along the way. Thank you for making Flight 2187 a special one." Passengers looked around, confused but moved by the unusual announcement. Many eyes turned toward the vice president, who was looking out the window, seemingly lost in thought. A flight attendant leaned down as she passed. "Sir, the captain was hoping you might come up to the cockpit after we land. He'd like to shake your hand." "That's really not necessary," Vance said. "I didn't do anything special." "With all due respect, sir," she replied, "that's not how the rest of us see it." As the plane began its descent, Vance's phone buzzed with a message. His aide was confirming that arrangements had been made. A private car would be waiting at the airport to take the family directly to their hotel. No shuttle, no waiting, no additional stress for parents who had enough to worry about. What Vance didn't know was that his simple act of kindness was already going viral. The videos taken by passengers had been uploaded using the in-flight Wi-Fi, and hashtag #VanceEconomy was trending on social media platforms. People who had never agreed with his politics were sharing the story, commenting on the unexpected display of humanity from a politician in a world where such gestures seemed increasingly rare. By the time the wheels touched down in Los Angeles, what had started as a quiet act of compassion was about to turn into something much bigger. The plane touched down smoothly at LAX, and passengers began the familiar routine of gathering belongings and checking phones that had been in airplane mode. As the ding sounded indicating it was safe to unbuckle, a collective gasp spread through economy class as people saw what was happening online. "Mr. Vice President," Pete said, showing Vance his phone screen, "you're trending." Vance frowned slightly as he looked at the hashtag #VanceEconomy and the video clips being shared. The footage was shaky but clear enough, him checking on the little girl, talking with the doctor, passing his note to the flight attendant. The comments ranged from surprised to deeply moved, with even his usual critics acknowledging the genuine moment. "I didn't realize anyone was recording," he said quietly. Frank chuckled. "In this day and age, everything gets recorded. Just be glad you weren't picking your nose." As the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers began standing in the aisles, but something unusual happened. Instead of the normal rush to deplane, people were hanging back, creating a path. The flight attendants were escorting the family with the little girl out first, helping carry their medical equipment. Vance stayed seated, watching as the parents carefully navigated the narrow aisle with their daughter. The mother looked exhausted but relieved that the flight was over. The father carried the little girl, whose eyes were bright despite her obvious medical challenges. As they passed row 16, the little girl spotted Vance and gave a small wave, clearly recognizing him despite not knowing the full story. Vance smiled and waved back, a simple human connection that someone, of course, captured on video. Once the family had deplaned, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Folks, we're going to ask for your patience as we deplane today. We'll be exiting by rows, starting from the back, to allow for a smoother process. Thank you for your cooperation." Pete looked confused. "That's backwards from how it usually works." "It is," Frank agreed, "but I think I know why." As the back rows began to exit, Vance's phone rang. It was his aide, sounding flustered. "Sir, there's a situation at the terminal. Reporters are gathering. Somehow they got wind of what happened on the flight. And sir, the story is everywhere. Every major network, social media, it's blown up in the last 20 minutes. Vance sighed. "How did they find out so quickly?" "One of the passengers is apparently an influencer with millions of followers. She posted the videos with a caption about you giving up your first-class seat for a sick child. It's been shared over 100,000 times already." Frank, overhearing the conversation, leaned over. "Welcome to the digital age, where no good deed goes unpublished." The plane continued to empty from the back, a reversal of the usual privilege system that normally prioritized first class. Vance realized the crew was deliberately keeping him on board until last, likely to help him avoid the media circus forming outside. Pete, still scrolling through his phone, looked up in amazement. "Sir, people who normally hate your politics are defending you. This woman here says, 'I've never voted for his party in my life, but this is what actual leadership looks like.' And the comments, they're actually civil. When does that ever happen online?" "It won't last," Vance said wryly. "Tomorrow they'll find something new to argue about." As they waited their turn to deplane, a flight attendant approached with a note. "From the family, sir. They asked me to give this to you before you left." Vance accepted the folded paper, opening it carefully. Inside was a crayon drawing clearly done by the little girl. A simple airplane with stick figures, one labeled VP with an arrow pointing to economy class. Beneath it, in an adult's handwriting, "Thank you for showing our daughter that important people can be kind people too." He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. By the time their row was finally called to deplane, only a handful of passengers remained. As Vance stood to leave, they broke into spontaneous applause. He looked embarrassed, quickly gathering his belongings and nodding thanks. At the front of the plane, the entire flight crew stood waiting. The captain stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mr. Vice President, on behalf of our crew, I want to thank you. In all my years flying, I've seen plenty of VIPs who would have caused a scene if they'd been asked to move. What you did today reminds us all that humanity matters more than status." "I appreciate that," Vance said, shaking his hand. "But please, this isn't about me. It was about that little girl and her family." "That's exactly why people are responding," the captain replied. "Because you made it about them, not you." As Vance stepped into the jet bridge, his Secret Service detail was waiting, looking tense. "Sir, there's quite a crowd gathered. We've arranged for an alternative exit route if you prefer to avoid the media." Frank, who was just behind Vance, spoke up. "If I might make a suggestion, Mr. Vice President, don't hide from this one. People are hungry for something genuine in politics. Maybe let them see it, just this once." Vance considered this for a moment, then turned to his security detail. "Let's take the regular exit, but I won't be making any statements. Sometimes actions should speak for themselves." As he walked toward the terminal, the story of what had happened at 30,000 feet continued to spread, reaching far beyond the confines of Flight 2187, a reminder that in a world often divided by politics, simple human decency could still cut through the noise, if only for a moment. The terminal was unusually crowded for a weekday afternoon. News crews had set up near the exit, and passengers from other flights had stopped to see what the commotion was about. As Vance emerged from the jet bridge, cameras turned and reporters began shouting questions. "Mr. Vice President, did you really give up your first-class seat? Was this planned, sir, or spontaneous? What made you check on the family during the medical situation?" His security detail formed a protective bubble around him, but Vance moved at an unhurried pace. He spotted the family with the little girl waiting near the baggage claim area, looking overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Airport staff were helping them with their luggage and medical equipment, but the father kept glancing nervously at the cameras. Vance made a decision. He veered slightly from his path, approaching the family directly. The reporters followed, but kept a respectful distance when they realized what was happening. "I just wanted to make sure you got here safely," Vance said to the parents, crouching down slightly to be at eye level with the little girl, who was now in a wheelchair. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she said shyly. "Thank you for the airplane toy." Vance looked surprised. "How did you know it was from me?" "The flight attendant didn't say, but I figured it out," she replied with the directness only children can manage. "You're the vice president. I saw you on TV once." Her father stepped forward, extending his hand. "Sir, we don't know how to thank you. Not just for the seat, but for—" He gestured to a black town car waiting outside with a driver holding a sign with their name. "We didn't arrange for that." "It's nothing," Vance assured him. "Just making sure you get to your treatment center without any more stress." The mother wiped away tears. "It's not nothing to us. We've been fighting insurance companies and bureaucracy for years. No one with influence has ever noticed, let alone helped." Nearby, Pete and Frank had paused to watch the interaction. Pete was still recording on his phone, while Frank stood with his arms folded, nodding approvingly. A senior airport official approached, looking nervous about the growing crowd. "Mr. Vice President, we have a private lounge prepared if you prefer to wait there for your transportation, and we can arrange secure exit for the family as well." Before Vance could respond, the little girl spoke up. "Are you in trouble because you sat in the back of the plane? My dad says people in Washington always get the best seats." The crowd fell silent, everyone straining to hear Vance's response. He smiled and knelt down to her level. "Not at all," he said. "The best seat on any plane is the one that gets you safely to the people who care about you. And sometimes the right thing to do is to give your seat to someone who needs it more." The girl considered this seriously. like when my brother lets me have the front seat when I'm feeling sick." "Exactly like that," Vance agreed. A reporter called out, "Mr. Vice President, does this experience change your perspective on healthcare policy?" Vance stood, his expression turning thoughtful. Instead of brushing off the question or giving a politician's non-answer, he looked directly at the family, then back at the reporter. "What this experience reminds me is that behind every policy debate are real families facing real challenges. Whatever our political differences, we should never lose sight of that basic truth." He turned back to the family. "I hope your daughter's treatment goes well. My office will check in to see if there's anything else you need during your stay in Los Angeles." As Vance prepared to leave, Frank approached him one last time. "You know," the older man said quietly, "I've voted both ways over the years. Never been much for party loyalty. I go by the character of the person. But what you did today, that's the kind of thing people remember when they step into a voting booth." "That wasn't why I did it," Vance replied. Frank grinned. "And that's exactly why it matters." Pete joined them, having finally put his phone away. "Sir, I just want to say thanks for helping with my paper. I submitted it right before we landed, and my professor already emailed me saying it's one of my best." "Glad to hear it," Vance said, shaking his hand. "Keep asking those tough policy questions. We need more critical thinkers." As Vance finally headed toward his waiting car, a young reporter stepped into his path. "Sir, just one last question. When your team planned this whole scenario, did they expect it to get this much positive coverage?" The question hung in the air, its cynical implication clear. For a moment, the terminal fell quiet again, everyone waiting for the response. Vance stopped walking. "Young man, not everything is a planned photo op. Sometimes a seat switch is just a seat switch. Sometimes a kind gesture is just a kind gesture. And sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply be human with each other." With that, he continued to his car, leaving behind a crowd that, for once, wasn't divided along political lines, but united in witnessing something increasingly rare in public life, an unscripted moment of genuine compassion. Back in Washington the next day, when asked by a White House reporter if the airline incident would be featured in upcoming campaign materials, Vance's response was simple. "There are some moments that should remain above politics." That was one of them. And against all expectations in a cynical political age, that's exactly what happened. The story remained what it was, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful leadership isn't about who gets the best seat, but who's willing to give it up when someone else needs it more.